Okay, so I want to talk about the evolution of symbiotic partnerships and the relevance of that to the major transitions in evolution. And I want to understand that system not just as sort of recognizing a pattern or a meta-pattern, but understanding the mechanisms that create that pattern. And I'm very much of the school that if I really understood the mechanisms behind that system, then I would be able to build it. I would understanding through building. So I want to build a model of that sort of system, not because I'm interested in models per se, but because I just want to know what the mechanisms are. Well, the mechanism that produces the major transitions in evolution is just evolution by natural selection. Darwin already told us everything that creates adaptation, it is only evolution by natural selection, so we know the mechanism already. Well, if that's true, let's build a model that does that, and we'll see if it works. Okay, so how does this evolution work is the motivating question. The conventional view of evolution is that it's an incremental improvement process, which in computer science we would call local search or hill climbing. Evolution based on that view has trouble with anything that's self-referential. So, for example, when there are changes in the mechanisms of phenotypic variation, as in the evolution of the genotype-phenotype map, or where evolution constructs the context of selection, as in niche construction, or modifies the mechanism of genetic inheritance, as in horizontal gene transfer, or when it redefines the evolutionary unit. Conventional evolutionary theory has trouble with that because it conceives evolution as a trial and error process in a fixed space of possibilities with a fixed definition of improvement and a fixed evolutionary unit. I think we need to formally characterize how the evolutionary axioms, by which I mean heritability, variability, fitness differences, and reproductive individuality itself, how they change over time as a result of past evolution. In particular, the circumstances under which evolution changes itself in a manner that improves its adaptive capability as a result of what we might call past experience. That's the domain of learning algorithms. It implies that we need to think of evolutionary processes not as trial and error processes, but as learning processes. So my approach to this is that thinking about how the relationships between things change rather than how the things themselves change is a way forward there. So in artificial intelligence, connectionism is the idea that complex cognitive functions arise from the organization of connections between many simple components, i.e. the neurons. And this is in contrast to a sort of homuncular view that there's something in the brain that makes it clever, right? All of the things in the brain are stupid, but if you organize them the right way, you get something clever. So evolutionary connectionism is the term that I use to represent the idea that adaptive complexes arise from the evolution of relationships, fitness affecting dependencies, between multiple co-evolving evolutionary entities, rather than through the internal complexification of any one evolutionary entity. Whereas neural connectionism depends on simple distributed learning mechanisms that modify correlations between neurons, evo-connectionism follows from natural selection, acting on heritable variation in the relationships between evolving units. So let me get you up to speed a little bit on associative learning in the context of neural networks in case you're not familiar with that. So in artificial neural networks, very simple, fully distributed learning rules are used, such as just reinforcing correlations, reinforcing the correlations that are frequent, which is known as Hebbian learning, which is often paraphrased as neurons that fire together wire together, although I don't think Hebb himself said that. It's just a very simple positive feedback principle. You can think of it as sort of correlation becomes causation. So neurons whose electrical activation was correlated because they were both stimulated by an external input become causally connected by a synaptic connection between them so that now they are both active even when only one of them is stimulated by the environment. What can that do? Well, in the context of neural networks, that very simple principle of reinforcing correlations is sufficient to do surprisingly interesting things, such as forming an associative memory that can store and recall multiple patterns of activation that are experienced in the past, learning low-dimensional models of high-dimensional data or inducing higher-level representations of a problem, and solving combinatorial optimization problems, constraint problems, including improvement in the ability to solve combinatorial optimization problems with experience. You can do all of that just by reinforcing correlations. That's old news in the context of neural networks. What's that got to do with natural selection? Well, When there is heritable variation that modifies the correlation of evolving entities or traits, rather than the entities themselves, it's the relationships between them, then the selective pressures on that variation that modifies correlations necessarily has the same form as associative learning that's familiar in neural networks. That's something that a result from work that I've been developing in various domains over the last few years, but it's really a very simple idea. It's a very simple observation. It's just the idea that you find the things that are already good together and you put them together more. That's what natural selection could do if it had heritable variation that could do that. So we might paraphrase that as entities that are selected together, wire together. So I've been investigating that in the context of regulatory interactions in gene networks. So you have a vector of gene expression levels and a matrix that controls the correlation of those gene expression levels, up and down regulatory interactions between genes. And if you evolve that to a distribution of target phenotypes, you'll find that the genes which are selected together most often in that distribution of target phenotypes upregulate one another. And if one gene is selected for and the other gene is selected against in that target phenotype, then they downregulate one another. That means that evolved gene regulation networks can recall phenotypes that have been selected for in the past and generalize phenotypes from past experience to new selective environments and recall preformed phenotypes from partial or corrupted embryonic phenotypes and all sorts of cool stuff like that that's relevant to the evolution of evolvability in evo-devo. But the principles also apply to the evolution of social or coevolutionary relationships between multiple evolutionary units. So in the GRN case, all of that network is inside one evolutionary unit. But it also applies to the evolution of relationships between multiple evolutionary units, and that's what's relevant to the major transitions that I want to talk about today. So in this talk, the question is, how can we make sense of how evolution creates new units of evolution? So I want to treat the unit of evolution not as a fixed parameter, but as an evolutionary variable. What organizing principles might help us understand how the relationships between evolutionary units at one level of organization feed into the creation of evolutionary units at another level of organization? And my claim is that existing theory of associative learning from machine learning helps us characterize the algorithmic principles underlying those processes. So here we're all familiar with what we mean by the evolutionary transitions from self-replicating molecules to protocells right up to multicellular organisms and colonies of multicellular organisms from Maynard Smith and Zathmary, where entities become part of a higher-level biological organization at the expense of their reproductive independence. Margulis describes one of those transitions, the transition to eukaryote cells with prokaryote organelles, as different bacteria form consortia that under ecological pressures associate and undergo metabolic and genetic change, such that their tightly integrated communities result in individuality at a more complex level of organization. How cool is that, right? That evolutionary entities that are supposed to be selfish optimizers get themselves into a situation where they lose their individuality to become part of a complex at a higher level of organization. This is obviously the biological realms of what Tyler was talking about in combigenesis or combinogenesis. We might go for that version of the word, but also what Dan was talking about in nested hierarchy. And I appreciate that Maynard Smith and Zathmary talked about transitions that weren't really nested hierarchies, but it is the nested hierarchy type that I'm talking about. So that's the phenomena. Does evolution by natural selection explain that phenomena? Well, there are problems. Why would an reproductively independent individual create a high-level evolutionary unit? Well, presumably the creation and maintenance of a new high-level organization is beneficial to the individual. Otherwise, the individual wouldn't enter into or sustain such a social contract. We can't assume that the individuals are merely victims of that higher-level organization, because we want the organization to be an evolutionary variable, a construct of the evolutionary process. The problem, though, is if the new unit doesn't conflict with or compromise individual interests, then it doesn't alter the evolutionary equilibria of the system. It doesn't make any difference to the evolutionary outcomes if all it does is enable them to do what they wanted to do anyway. Well, you say, well, maybe an individual enters into a social contract that creates a higher level organization because of their individual interests, but maybe that contract is binding in the long term in such a way that they subsequently are forced to do some behavior because of that contract that they didn't want to do, and that would alter evolutionary outcomes. But that has a problem. It has a problem that that organization can't be evolved because of the social benefit that it will confer in an as yet unrealized future. We can't have the future causing the past, as Dan reminded us. So if it should end up ultimately changing evolutionary outcomes in a manner that increases social welfare, well, that seems like that would just have to be a coincidence. It could have equally likely have decreased social welfare. So can social contracts evolve for one reason now, reinforcing what individuals already want, and nonetheless systematically increase social welfare later? And if it did, would that be increasing it now for one reason and increasing social welfare later for another reason? But if they were systematically related, they can't really be different reasons. They have to be the same underlying reason. So that's the way that I conceive the problem. And I'm going to make a model of evolution by natural selection modifying the unit of evolution, and I'm keeping the model deliberately simple, right? I don't want to put anything in the model that I don't have to put in it. This model is as simple as I could make it. It's already more complex than I would like. Okay, so my approach is I assume that individuals can utilize the capabilities or features of some other species to their benefit. So the byproducts of species X are beneficial or utilized by the species Y, or the environment provided by X provides a safe habitat for species Y, or something like that. And I'm going to represent that with an evolutionary polyplayer game. And then I'm going to assume that organisms can adapt to gain more reliable access to those benefits that they get from other species. So they could evolve characters that attract those species together, or move to environments that contain those species differentially, or adhere to that species when they bump into it. I'm thinking about bacteria. Or through transmitting a symbiont vertically. Those are things which make more reliable access to the benefits that you get from other species. So I'm simply going to endow individuals with the capability to genetically specify in a completely trivial way which other species do you want to be in a partnership with. And that partnership means a change in the likelihood that A meets B, species A meets species B, and also a shared selective fate, that if species A dies, species B dies, and vice versa. So in terms of cooperative game theory, if you want to think about it that way, the partnerships are coalitions that enable coordinated strategies and pool resources, share utility. And in terms of natural selection, those partnerships are new evolutionary units. So that's an explicit change, which I'm giving individuals a genetically trivial way of specifying, an explicit change in the unit of selection. But that's usually assumed to be the main problem in the transitions, is how do you get a change in the unit of selection? But I don't think that it is, for three reasons. First, a change in the unit of selection is not that hard to understand. So a student of mine's been working on a concept that he calls social niche construction, where an individual has entities that modify population structure in a way that modifies the relatedness of individuals that interact. So an example is under a type 1 group selection model, large groups favor defect, whereas small groups have greater between-group variance, assuming that groups are formed by random binomial sampling, and has stronger group selection and can support higher levels of cooperation. If we give individuals individual traits that enable them to make either small groups or large groups, or to which group size they prefer, which would they prefer? Since it's under individual selection, you might think, well, individuals are selfish, so they'll create the large groups where selfish individuals prevail. But in fact, they don't. They create the small groups where cooperative individuals prevail. In that way, everybody is better off. So that sort of process is sufficient for individuals to modify population structure, like the size of a container, in order to change the unit of selection. But a change in the unit of selection isn't sufficient to increase social welfare unless there's no social frustration. So by social frustration, the easiest way to think about that is just the analog of genetic epistasis. So if we were talking about multi-locus population genetics and trying to evolve fit genotypes, that would be easy if there wasn't any epistasis. If there is epistasis that creates local optima in the fitness landscape, then that's hard. So likewise, if we're in a social game that doesn't have any social frustration, it's trivial to find configurations that maximize social welfare, so long as you're selecting for maximizing social welfare. But in games that have social frustration, even when you're selecting for maximizing social welfare, it's hard to find configurations of individual strategies that will give you that. So increasing the level of selection can increase social welfare in systems that don't have any social frustration. That might be relevant to things like where the benefit of group living is just economies of scale that's relevant to the fraternal transitions, like the transition to multicellularity. But it's not so relevant to the egalitarian transitions, like the transition from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, where there's sure to be social frustration. And thirdly, I'm going to show you in a minute that even when you endow individuals in a trivial way to change the unit of selection, they fuck it up. They don't create groups which are good for maximizing social welfare, except under some ecological conditions, and I want to examine what the ecological conditions are that cause them to do that. Okay, so first I need to describe the evolutionary game. I want a game that represents significant social frustration, but I don't want it to be impossibly hard. It needs to be the case that if you could find the right partnerships, the game would be solvable. So the ecological dynamics are specified by an underlying polyplayer evolutionary game that has many different ecological attractors, or Nash equilibria, or ESSs. It's 200 species making a 200-player game, but that game is divided into 20 subgames of 10 species each in the following manner. So we have disjoint subsets of species. Each of those blocks is not 1 pixel, but 10, a group of 10, playing a coordination game with everybody else in that group of 10. And they don't actually interact with any of the others, but they don't know that. What's the purpose of that game? What sort of properties does it have? Well, one row here is an example of Nash equilibrium in that game. I didn't do 200 and I didn't do 10 in each group, but you get the idea. So within one subgame, all of the individuals in that game will coordinate if they want to increase their individual utility. So if the majority of individuals in the initial conditions are defectors, it'll go to all defect, and if the majority of individuals in the initial conditions is all cooperate, it'll go to all cooperate. But individual selection won't have any control over which of those two ESSs it goes to, it just goes to the nearest one. So within any one subgame, you'll either go to cooperate or you'll go to defect. We're about 50%, exactly 50% actually, probability. But over all of the subgames in the polyplayer game, some will go to cooperate and some will go to defect, and others will go to cooperate and others will go to defect. The chances that all of them go to cooperate is exponentially low in the number of games that you're playing. So this is a game where it's hard to find all cooperate, but I'll show in a minute that it's not impossibly difficult. The attractor that globally maximizes social welfare, i.e. all cooperate, has a basin of attraction that's exponentially small in system size. So if we take one particular ESS and we consider introducing a single cooperator into one of the games where defect is currently prevailing, then obviously that single cooperator can't invade that equilibrium by definition of it being an equilibrium. In principle, though, if there was a whole bunch of cooperators that were selected on as a unit, they could displace that whole bunch of defectors. All cooperate is fitter than all defect, but they would have to be selected on as a unit to do that and all arrive together. So a group of Cs could invade that equilibrium, and then the group of Cs would have the property of being able to invade where none of the parts would be able to invade individually. That's the synergistic effect or emergent benefit of the group. But to do that, evolution by natural selection would need to identify which species belong in the group. So which K species, 10 species, out of 200 species are the species that should be in a group. And it would need to determine what strategies they should be playing. So out of the 10 species, each of which can be cooperate and defect, there's 2 to the 10 possible combinations of strategies, and all cooperate is the one you want. It's clear that individual selection can't solve that problem. It just finds the nearest ESS by definition. But in fact, a genetic algorithm with any fixed level of selection can't solve that problem. Even if I select on total welfare, it's just going to find the same configurations because, in fact, the local optima in social welfare are identical to the ESSs under individual selection. But the problem isn't impossibly hard. If somehow you knew the problem structure and you solved each sub-problem separately, i.e. you figured out that it should be all cooperate, and then you put the sub-solutions together, then it would be an easy problem. So if partnerships evolved, which corresponded to the subgames so that these individuals were all in a unit together, then groups of cooperators would be able to invade groups of defectors and everything would be hunky-dory. Notice that, in a sense then, blocks of cooperators compete with blocks of defectors as coordinated entities, as higher-level individuals, which would mean that you'd effectively reduce the number of configurations that you need to consider within each game from 2 to the k down to 2. Should it be all cooperate? Should it be all defect? Which is a bit like a coarse graining of the game, as though they become single-bit strategies in a higher level game, which is exactly what I want it to be. But how do you discover that structure? It's all very well saying if you knew that structure, it would be easy to solve. But discovering problem structure automatically in a bottom-up manner without a priori knowledge of the problem structure is a cutting-edge problem in machine learning. But it isn't impossible. There are some sophisticated model building methods, including some specific types of neural networks, that can do that kind of automatic problem decomposition. But can individual selection on traits that modify the unit of selection find those units? That's the question. Okay, so here's my model. I have a bunch of species. In each species of type 1, there are lots of individuals of type 1. I'm going to take a random selection of individuals from different species and have them play the polyplayer game, which we can think of as an analog for the ecological dynamics of the system. So I take a random frequency of individuals from each of the species, I put them in the ecological dynamics, I run the ecological dynamics forward through time, which just means play the game, and I see which species come to the top and which species are competitively excluded. But that's just playing the game. That's just going to find the local ESSs in the system. But then I allow individuals in those species to genetically specify which other species they want to form a partnership with. Oh, you can't see those colors, can you? Good job. Okay, so in species 2, an individual in species 2 is genetically specifies that it wants to have a partnership with an individual from species 4, or with 4 and 1, or 9 and 8, or whatever. That's through random variation. Then those individuals, including the original singletons and the composites, and perhaps composites of composites, get put into the ecological dynamics, and we see who comes to the top. They play the game. So 9 plus 8 is playing as a coalition in this game now. They have coordinated strategy and shared utility, and that coalition did well, and this coalition did badly, just from playing the game. And of course, the ones that win go back into the populations of the species, and the ones that lose don't. So in that way, we have evolution of the partnerships over time. Okay, so which partnerships evolve? Well, it turns out that the partnerships that evolve are sensitive to the ecological contexts in which they evolve. So if I allow the game, the ecological dynamics, to come to an equilibrium, and then I allow the genetic changes to start evolving partnerships at that equilibrium, all that happens is that you just canalize the equilibrium that you're already at. So let's take an example equilibrium like the first group went to C and the second group went to D. All that happens is that the associations between those species just canalize that one equilibrium, which would mean that then whatever initial conditions I put the system to, that it would go to that equilibrium. So that's not very interesting. And it doesn't increase social welfare. So these are different independent runs from random initial conditions of the ecological dynamics. It goes to a local ESS. Some ESSs increase the number of cooperators, some ESSs decrease the number of cooperators. If they just happen to start off with more than 50% cooperate, they would go to all cooperate within that game. None of them find all cooperate in all of the games, which would be up here. And although partnerships are evolving on this longer time scale, there's a break in the time axis here. Although partnerships are evolving, they don't alter the social equilibria of the game. Okay, so if the partnerships that evolve at a given ESS just reinforce or canalize that ESS, maybe we should keep the ecological dynamics out of equilibrium. Maybe we would get something more interesting there. So instead of allowing the ecological equilibrium to equilibrate and then evolving partnerships, I'll continually perturb the ecological equilibrium to keep it out of equilibrium, and then partnerships will evolve on the transients of that game rather than at the Nash equilibria. What happens if we do that? Well, again, we get some good associations between species. Perhaps I should tell you what this matrix is. So this is all species against all other species, and the color represents have they figured out that cooperators go with cooperators and defectors go with defectors, which would be green, or have you got associations between cooperators and defectors, which is not the right thing to do, which would be red. So in addition to, although it has figured out that there's quite a bit of green on the block diagonal where the subgames are, there's also lots of other crap here too as well. So there's lots of random partnerships. Okay, so that didn't work. What if, through a hunch that comes from previous work that's sort of coming from left field a little bit, what if instead of over here where I didn't perturb the ecological dynamics at all, or over here where I was perturbing them all the time, what if I just perturb them occasionally and put the figure in the middle. So here I'm going to reset the species frequencies to a random initial condition and let it equilibrate and evolve partnerships at that equilibrium for a while. And then I'm going to reset it to a random initial condition and let them equilibrate and let them evolve partnerships at that equilibrium for a while, and so on. So that partnerships will evolve over a distribution of local equilibria instead of just one, or instead of configurations which are arbitrary. And what we get in that case is if partnerships evolve over different ecological contexts, each of which are locally optimal, then you get good partnerships, and only the good partnerships evolve, just as I wanted. It's nothing like having a clear idea of what you wanted to do before you do it, that was okay, so why did it do that? Well, the conditions for doing that can either be done over multiple ecological contexts in time or in space. This is just a sort of refinement of the model now. So I was explaining to you now how to do it in time. So you have one system and you perturb it occasionally and let it relax again. Or you can do it with multiple ecological demes separated in space where individuals and their partners migrate from one deme to another. And then you don't need the perturbations, but you do need the spatial localization. But I sort of prefer the multiple ecological context in time, because then it makes it clear that there's no multi-demic metapopulation type thing going on. Okay, with those evolved partnerships, although in the short term the system just reaches the local ESS as before, in the long term it starts to escape those local ESSs and increase social welfare significantly. So this is the transition that I was looking for. Here we have groups of cooperators invading groups of defectors in a way that individual cooperators couldn't, because they found which groups they should belong to. Why are they finding those groups? One, what goes wrong in the other cases? Well, when the ecological dynamics are out of equilibrium, there are many opportunities for unfit individuals to form partnerships with fit individuals because it's to their selfish benefit to do so. So if I'm in a situation where I'm a defector but most of the others are cooperators, I could form a relationship with a cooperator because they're being selected for, and that would make me better off. So when the system is out of equilibrium, there are lots of partnerships which are between cooperators and defectors, both ways around, that are not the ones that we wanted. When we're at ecological equilibrium, in fact, there aren't any partnerships that are beneficial because nobody's increasing in frequency by definition of being at equilibrium. So forming a partnership with somebody isn't going to increase your fitness. But there are still two classes of partnership. There's the partnerships between two individuals which are present at equilibrium. That doesn't make any difference because they're already present at equilibrium. And then there's partnerships between somebody that's present at equilibrium and somebody that isn't, somebody that's selected against. And that would be bad. So although there aren't any partnerships that are overtly beneficial, there are some partnerships which are neutral, which just canalize what's already there, and there are some partnerships which are bad, which are between individuals which don't co-occur at that equilibrium. So over a distribution of equilibria, partnerships evolve between pairs of species that co-occur most often. So accordingly, the partnerships that evolve under these ecological conditions evolve because they're the most reliably non-deleterious partnerships, rather than because they're overtly beneficial. We could simply say they're the most robust partnerships. In fact, when they evolved, they didn't increase social welfare at all. So that figure which I showed you a moment ago, during this long time period when nothing appears to be happening, that's when the partnerships are evolving. But those partnerships later enable escape from the local optima and increases in social welfare. So the immediate individual benefit of evolving those partnerships is for robustness. It doesn't really change anything, it just keeps things as they are. But the long-term consequence is an increase in social welfare. The long period of stasis isn't doing nothing, it's evolving structural relationships between components that will have consequences for future evolutionary outcomes. Although the future evolutionary outcomes can't be the reason why this was evolving those partnerships. But it's not a coincidence either. So the partnerships that are robust are the same as the partnerships that, when established, enable escape from local optima. And that's because both of those are the partnerships that correspond to the problem structure, the sub-games within the polyplayer game. So the species that co-occur because of their mutual dependencies with one another, because they're playing a game with one another, rather than the species that co-occur by accident. So when I'm at an ESS, all of the other individuals in my game are coordinated with me because we're playing a coordination game. But there might be some other cooperators in other games. Well, that's just a coincidence. You know, they had a 50-50 chance of being cooperatives or being defectors. So if I look at which combinations of individual strategies co-occur most often over a distribution of equilibria, I'll find that within a game they always correlate, but between games they only correlate half the time. They don't correlate more than random. So under these ecological conditions, all you need to do to find the structure of the game is just reinforce the species that already co-occur most often. That's what I said in that last bit too. Good. So you'll notice that that has the flavor of the Hebbian learning mantra that I mentioned earlier, neurons that fire together, wire together, only here it's more like species that co-occur together, wire together. But it's a little bit more complicated than that because it has a multi-scale flavor. So what's multi-scale associative learning? How would you solve that type of constraint problem if you were trying to do it with a neural network rather than with this sort of individual-based model of evolution? Well, you'd learn the associations between the problem variables, and then you'd use the associations to collapse the dimensionality of that search space into emergent macro-scale problem variables at a new level of representation, and then you'd search for associations between those and so on. That's a multi-scale associative learning process. The advantage of that process is that although it's a high-dimensional model capable of representing complex nonlinear functions in the end, at any one level of that process, you have very limited model complexity. You're just learning pairwise correlations. And that's very important for not learning configurations which are overfitted, despite the fact that you have a high-dimensional model. In neural network terms, Geoffrey Hinton, where's his picture? There's his picture. Geoffrey Hinton has a process called deep learning, which uses multiple layers of associative learning to do just that. The catch is, how do you know what variables to bind together before you've had a chance to search combinations of them at the next level, right? It's like, I could put these things together and that might be useful for solving the problem at the next level, but if I haven't done that yet, how do I know that they're the right things to put together? That's the problem that's solved. And the trick is that rather than making groups that are overtly good, you just make groups that don't make things worse, the ones that are most robust, which means you can just reinforce the existing co-occurrence at local optima. And why does that work? It works because combinations of variables that usually don't disrupt locally optimal solutions have stronger internal dependencies than external dependencies. And that means that they have semi-independent value, which means that they'll be useful in another context. You can get that in an ecosystem if, but only if, evolution occurs within appropriate ecological conditions. A novel type of multi-scale neural network that's approximately like deep learning is the only other known algorithm to be able to solve those social constraints that I described in that game in polynomial time. So let me spell out the analogy. On the one hand, we have multi-scale associative learning that you can do in a neural network, and on the other hand, we have multi-scale evolution. So one is a state-of-the-art scalable machine learning method to discover and exploit problem structure bottom-up, and the other is evolution by natural selection, where the unit of selection is evolvable, and the ecological and evolutionary timescales are coupled appropriately. In the neural network, you have electrical activation potentials, which are modified by synaptic connections, which are learned over time. And in the evolutionary system, you have the existing units of selection, the species densities, which modify rapidly, which are modified slowly by evolving genetic partnerships between species. The neural system effects a rescaling of dynamical variables, which is the analog of the new evolutionary units in the multi-scale evolution process. And that's valuable to neural learning because it limits model complexity at every stage. That's necessary for this system because it means that you can do it with only incremental improvement. If the model complexity was too high from the beginning, you wouldn't be able to do it with evolution by natural selection. So under these ecological conditions, in the neural network, you have associative learning at one scale that's finding the units that associative learning at the next scale can exploit. And in the neural system, you have selection for robustness rather than explicit fitness gains is the right way to find semi-independent subsets of species that selection at the next level can exploit, and so on. Some observations before I sum up. I'm not saying that evolution by natural selection is really clever because it discovers how to do associative learning. In fact, evolution by natural selection doesn't discover how to do associative learning. The system that's exhibiting associative learning here is not a Darwinian unit until later. So how is it exhibiting Hebbian learning then? Well, in fact, I suggest that associative learning is not as clever as you think it is. Associative learning is a trivial and inevitable process that happens as just a result of energy minimization on associations between variables. It's a type of memory or internal state that comes for free in the right kind of complex dynamical system or irritable substance. So the right kind of dynamical systems includes brains, and it includes gene networks and ecosystems, but it also includes, I can show, physical complex systems, just systems of particles with springs between them where the springs deform slightly over time. You don't need evolution by natural selection to do associative learning, is the message. And the way in which associative learning is working together with evolution by natural selection in this model is that although each unit is evolving by evolution by natural selection, the system as a whole is doing associative learning spontaneously, as it were. And the principles of memory and learning, and more generally machine learning, augment the principle of blind variation and selection to help us understand things like the necessary conditions and properties for a system to exhibit that outcome, or the type of problem or social constraints that it can and can't solve, or the relationship between evolution and evolvability and fitting to data and overfitting to data versus generalization, benefit now on the training set versus benefit later on the test set. All of those concepts from machine learning are threading through this work that I'm telling you about. So what's the take-home message? The T-shirt message. Darwin's got your back. Evolution by natural selection with respect to any one evolutionary unit might occur in the conventional hill-climbing way, if you're okay with fixed heritability, fixed variability, fixed units of selection, nothing context-sensitive about the process, and therefore nothing self-referential. But Hebb, or who I'm using to stand in for machine learning theory more generally, Hebb makes sense of how evolutionary entities change their interactions over time. And it gives us, or it leads into, a theory for the origin of organizations that Darwinian evolution by natural selection doesn't give us. In this case, evolution amongst many co-evolving entities with heritable variation in relationships constitutes a multi-scale associative learning machine that's a completely quite different algorithmic framework from hill climbing that Darwin gave us. And I want to give thanks to those people who contributed to this work. Thank you.